Every day, a small paralyzed puppy named Max would struggle desperately to move his lifeless back legs on the physical therapy mat at Second Chance Animal Rehabilitation Center. His determined eyes focused on Sarah, the dedicated therapist who had been working with him for months, as he pushed with his front paws, dragging his immobile hind legs behind him. On this particular morning, as Sarah coaxed him forward with gentle encouragement, something extraordinary happened, something the veterinarians had said was impossible. When she witnessed Max's response, tears immediately streamed down her face, her hands trembling as she called for the other staff to come quickly. What incredible journey had brought this brave little soul from complete paralysis to this miraculous moment? How had a puppy, abandoned and given no chance of recovery after a devastating spinal injury, found the strength to defy all medical predictions? The answer lies in an extraordinary tale of perseverance, specialized care, and an unbreakable bond between a determined therapist and a little dog who refused to give up. The small golden retriever puppy had arrived at the center 4 months earlier, his tiny body limp and broken, his back legs splayed at unnatural angles, showing no response even to painful stimuli. His fur was matted with dirt and debris, his eyes clouded with fear and confusion. Despite his condition, there was something in those eyes that captivated everyone who saw him, a spark, a will to live that defied his broken body. The veterinarians had shaken their heads gravely, explaining that the spinal damage was severe, likely caused by being hit by a car and left untreated for days. This puppy will never walk again, they had said with clinical certainty, suggesting humane euthanasia as the most compassionate option. But Sarah had seen something in Max's eyes that the others had missed, a fighting spirit that refused to surrender. Against all medical advice, Sarah had convinced the center's director to give Max a chance. 3 months, she had pleaded. Give me 3 months to try. Though skeptical, the director had relented, moved by Sarah's passionate belief that this little soul deserved a fighting chance. Now, 4 months later, as Max struggled forward on the therapy mat, his eyes locked with Sarah's, something miraculous was about to happen, a moment that would validate every hour of heartache, every sleepless night, and every tear shed along their journey together. What no one knew as they watched was just how far both Max and Sarah had come to reach this extraordinary turning point, and how their lives would never be the same again. The journey had begun on a cold winter evening when a local shelter called the Rehabilitation Center about a puppy found abandoned by the side of the road. The shelter staff had no resources to care for a paralyzed animal, and were preparing to make the difficult decision to euthanize him. Sarah had been working late that night, finishing paperwork when the call came through. Without hesitation, she had driven through the snow to collect the injured puppy, cradling his broken body against her coat as she carried him back to her car. I don't know if we can help you, she had whispered to him, but I promise we'll try. The puppy had looked up at her with those soulful eyes, and something passed between them, a silent pact that would bind their futures together. Back at the center, the examination had been grim. Martinez, the center's lead veterinarian, had performed a thorough assessment, his experienced hands gently probing Max's spine as X-rays revealed the devastating truth. The impact fractured his vertebrae at T10 and T11, he explained to Sarah, pointing to the shadowy images on the screen. There's severe compression of the spinal cord. Even if we operate, the chances of him regaining function are less than 5%. Sarah had listened silently, her heart sinking with each word, but her determination unwavering. We've seen miracles before, she replied quietly, remembering other cases that had defied the odds. Martinez had placed a compassionate hand on her shoulder. Not like this, Sarah. I don't want you to set yourself up for heartbreak. But Sarah knew that sometimes heartbreak was the price of hope, and she was willing to pay it. That night, she had stayed at the center, sleeping on a cot beside Max's kennel. Every few hours, she would wake to check on him, adjusting his position to prevent pressure sores, offering water, and speaking softly to reassure him he wasn't alone. By morning, her decision was made. She would fight for this puppy, no matter what anyone said. The rehabilitation would be intensive, expensive, and might ultimately prove futile, but every living being deserved a chance to overcome the impossible. As the sun rose, casting golden light across Max's sleeping form, Sarah made him a promise. We're in this together, little one. All the way to the end, whatever that may be. The rehabilitation center buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a place dedicated to healing. Specialized equipment lined the sterile walls, parallel bars scaled for animal therapy, balance boards, hydrotherapy tanks with their gentle bubbling sounds, and rows of custom mobility aids. The air carried the faint scent of antiseptic mixed with the earthy smell of therapy dogs and determined animals fighting to regain their strength. In a corner room with large windows that let in streams of natural light, Max lay on a specially padded examination table, his golden fur freshly washed and combed, gleaming under the LED lights. His hindquarters remained motionless despite his alert expression, his back legs splayed unnaturally to the sides while his front paws moved with eager energy whenever someone approached. Sarah stood beside him in her blue therapy scrubs, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, stethoscope around her neck. Her face showed the careful professional mask she had perfected over years of working with severely injured animals, compassionate but guarded, hopeful yet realistic. Her colleagues knew her as the center's most dedicated therapist, the one who took on the cases others deemed hopeless, but they also worried about the emotional toll each failure took on her. "Good morning, buddy," she said softly to Max, her fingers gently stroking behind his ears as his tail remained motionless, another cruel reminder of his paralysis. Martinez entered the room, carrying Max's extensive medical file, his expression betraying his skepticism about the case. The therapy room had been transformed into a sanctuary of hope, equipped with every possible tool that might help in Max's recovery journey. A water treadmill stood in one corner, its clear walls allowing therapists to observe limb movement underwater. Beside it was a rack of colorful therapy balls of various sizes, alongside resistance bands, sensory mats, and specialized harnesses designed to support an animal's weight while allowing movement. Charts tracking nerve function and muscle response hung on a nearby whiteboard, mostly empty except for baseline measurements that painted a grim picture of Max's condition. The morning light streaming through the large windows created a halo effect around the puppy's golden fur, highlighting the stark contrast between his eager, bright eyes and his lifeless lower body. Other staff members occasionally peeked into the room, drawn by curiosity about the center's newest and most challenging patient. Jessica, a veterinary technician with 10 years of experience, lingered in the doorway, her eyes soft with compassion. "He's beautiful," she said quietly. "Such a shame about the spine injury." Dar. Martinez nodded solemnly as he examined the latest test results. Complete lack of deep pain response in both hind limbs, he noted clinically, though his voice carried a hint of genuine regret. Bladder and bowel function will need to be manually managed indefinitely. Sarah listened to their assessment, her hands never leaving Max's fur, providing the constant reassurance that she would be there through whatever came next. Despite the clinical conversation happening around him, Max's eyes remained fixed on Sarah, as if he understood that she was his champion in this sterile world of medical equipment and uncertain futures. Throughout the examination, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, but those who knew her well could see the subtle signs of her growing attachment, the way she positioned herself protectively between Max and others, how her fingers gently stroked his fur when test results were discussed, the determined set of her jaw when prognosis turned negative. As sunlight shifted across the room, casting long shadows on the gleaming linoleum floor, there was an unspoken understanding forming between therapist and patient, a bond that would be tested through pain, disappointment, and the grueling path that lay ahead. In that moment, as Max rested his head trustingly against Sarah's hand, neither of them knew just how deeply their lives would become intertwined, or how their journey together would challenge everything the medical staff believed about recovery, resilience, and the healing power of unconditional devotion. Martinez carefully examined Max, his experienced hands gently probing along the puppy's spine as Sarah watched anxiously. "Complete loss of motor function below the T10 vertebra," he said, his voice clinical but tinged with compassion. "No deep pain response in either hind limb." He demonstrated by pinching one of Max's back paws firmly. "No reaction." Spinal trauma this severe rarely shows significant improvement, especially after being left untreated for days. Sarah nodded, absorbing the information while scratching gently behind Max's ears. The puppy's eyes, bright and trusting despite his condition, followed her movements with unwavering attention. "What are we looking at in terms of quality of life?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. Martinez sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Best case scenario, with intensive rehabilitation, he might regain some bladder and bowel control. Walking again. That's extremely unlikely. We're talking about permanent paralysis, manual bladder expression several times daily, watching for pressure sores, potential respiratory complications." He paused, noticing Sarah's determined expression. Sarah, I know that look. This isn't like your other cases. The damage is too severe. Even with all our resources, you're looking at months of therapy with minimal improvement. We need to consider whether that's in his best interest. Jessica, the head veterinary nurse, entered with Max's blood work results, her eyes softening when she saw the puppy. He's a fighter, isn't he? She remarked, noticing how Max attempted to pull himself forward with his front legs despite his immobile hindquarters. Found in a ditch beside Highway 16, she added, scanning the intake notes. Animal control thinks he was hit and abandoned at least 3 days before someone reported him. Sarah's jaw tightened at this information. 3 days lying there, unable to move. She murmured, her hand protectively stroking Max's flank. Martinez placed a hand on her shoulder. That's why we need to be realistic about his prospects. The window for effective intervention after spinal trauma. I want to try, Sarah interrupted, her voice soft but resolute. Just give me 3 months with him. If there's no improvement by then, She swallowed hard. I'll accept your recommendation. The doctor exchanged glances with Jessica, both recognizing the emotional investment already forming. This will require extraordinary commitment, he cautioned. Daily physical therapy, hydrotherapy, manual stimulation of limbs, bladder management. Even then, I don't want you to get your hopes up. Sarah nodded, already mentally planning the intensive rehabilitation schedule. I understand the prognosis, but something about him. She looked down at Max, who stared back with those soulful eyes. He deserves a chance. Dar. Martinez reviewed Max's radiographs displayed on the wall-mounted screen, pointing to the crushed vertebrae clearly visible in the images. The spinal cord compression is severe. In human medicine, they'd perform decompression surgery immediately, but even then, recovery would be uncertain. He turned to face Sarah directly. I need to be absolutely clear. Medical literature suggests less than a 5% chance of meaningful recovery with injuries this severe. Sarah held his gaze. I've seen animals defy those odds before. The doctor nodded reluctantly. Yes, but usually with less catastrophic injuries. This puppy may never walk again regardless of what we do. As they discussed Max's treatment plan, the puppy attempted to drag himself toward the edge of the examination table where a small stuffed toy lay just out of reach. Sarah quickly moved it closer, and Max grabbed it with surprising enthusiasm, his front legs strong and coordinated despite his paralyzed hindquarters. Look at that determination, she whispered, something resolving in her expression. He's not giving up, so neither will I. Dar. Martinez made some final notes in Max's chart, his professional skepticism tempered by respect for Sarah's expertise. I'll approve the rehabilitation plan, he conceded, but we'll need to reassess at regular intervals. If he shows signs of distress or declining quality of life, we revisit this discussion. Sarah nodded, grateful for even this conditional support. Thank you. I'll document everything meticulously. As the medical team prepared to leave, Sarah remained with Max, connecting with him through gentle touches and soft words. We've got a long road ahead of us, buddy, she murmured as she carefully adjusted his position to prevent pressure on vulnerable areas. It won't be easy, but I'll be with you every step of the way. In that moment, as sunlight streamed through the window illuminating particles of dust dancing in the air, Sarah made a silent promise, not that she would make him walk again, but that whatever quality of life was possible for him, she would help him achieve it. Looking into his eyes, trusting and bright despite his broken body, she felt the weight of that commitment settle into her heart, becoming part of her in a way that would change them both forever. The first therapy session began with uncertainty hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Sarah had prepared the rehabilitation room meticulously. Comfortable padding covered the floor, gentle heat lamps provided warmth, and an array of specialized equipment stood ready. Max watched from his cushioned mat, ears perked forward with curiosity despite his immobile lower body. Let's start with something simple, Sarah said softly, kneeling beside him. She gently took one of his hind legs between her hands, supporting the joint as she slowly moved it through passive range of motion exercises. Max flinched at first, not from pain but from the strange sensation of having limbs move that he couldn't feel or control. It's okay, buddy, Sarah reassured him, her touch gentle but confident. This will help prevent muscle atrophy while we work on getting those nerve pathways firing again. Max whimpered softly as she continued the exercises, moving each joint carefully through its full range. Jessica entered with a mobile ultrasound machine to check for deep tissue response. How's our patient doing? She asked, setting up the equipment beside them. Sarah sighed, massaging tiny circles into Max's muscles. "He's tolerating it, but I can tell he's confused about why we're manipulating limbs he can't feel." Jessica nodded sympathetically as she applied gel to Max's hind leg. "Poor guy doesn't understand why his body won't cooperate anymore." The ultrasound revealed minimal blood flow to the muscle tissue below the injury site, another discouraging sign. Sarah tried not to let her disappointment show as she moved on to stimulation exercises, using a small vibrating tool designed to activate nerve endings. Max showed no response, his back legs remaining limp despite the stimulation. By the end of the hour-long session, both Sarah and Max were exhausted, she from the emotional toll of working against such overwhelming odds, he from the stress of being handled in ways his damaged nervous system couldn't process. "Not the breakthrough first day I was hoping for," Sarah admitted to Jessica as they carefully returned Max to his specially padded kennel. The next morning, Sarah arrived early, determined to try a different approach. She'd spent half the night researching alternative therapies for severe spinal injuries, and had decided to incorporate water therapy earlier than initially planned. "The buoyancy might help him feel those muscles working even if he can't control them yet," she explained to Dr. Martinez, who remained skeptical but approved the adjusted protocol. Max, however, had other ideas. When Sarah attempted to lower him into the specially designed hydrotherapy tank, he panicked, thrashing with his front legs, his eyes wide with fear. Whoa, it's okay," Sarah soothed, immediately lifting him out and cradling him against her chest. His heart raced wildly, his small body trembling. "Let's try something else today," she whispered into his soft fur. For the next week, therapy sessions followed a frustrating pattern. Sarah would introduce a new technique, supported standing exercises, electrical stimulation, therapeutic massage, and each would yield the same result: no response in Max's hind legs, no sign of returning sensation. The kennel staff began to whisper when they thought Sarah couldn't hear, their voices tinged with pity for both the paralyzed puppy and the therapist who couldn't accept reality. "She's going to break her heart over this one veteran tech remarked. "Some cases you just can't fix, no matter how much you want to." Despite these murmurs, Sarah persisted, adjusting her approach daily, refusing to give up even as the days stretched into weeks with no measurable improvement. By the third week, the emotional toll became visible in Sarah's face, dark circles under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. She had begun spending her lunch breaks with Max, bringing her sandwich to his kennel, talking to him about her plans for the next session while gently massaging his unresponsive limbs. It was during one of these quiet moments that she noticed something, so small she thought she might have imagined it. While massaging his right hind leg, applying gentle pressure to the paw pad, Max's smallest toe twitched almost imperceptibly. Sarah froze, her heart suddenly pounding. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, repeating the pressure. There it was again, the tiniest movement, barely visible but definitely real. Sarah called for Jessica, trying to contain her excitement. "Watch his right foot, the smallest toe," she instructed, applying the same gentle pressure. Jessica leaned in, eyes narrowed in concentration. When the toe twitched again, her eyes widened. "That's voluntary movement," she breathed, looking up at Sarah with the first genuine hope either of them had felt since Max's arrival. "It's minimal, but..." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "But it's something. It's a start." That afternoon, the rehabilitation sessions took on new energy, Sarah's voice brighter as she worked with Max. "Remember, buddy, Rome wasn't built in a day," she told him as she carefully stretched his limbs. "Neither is a new nervous system, but we're on our way now." As she packed up her equipment that evening, the smallest flicker of movement, that tiny, miraculous twitch, had reignited the hope that had begun to flicker dangerously low. It wasn't walking, it wasn't even close, but it was proof that somewhere in Max's damaged spine, a signal had found its way through. Sarah spent every spare moment researching innovative therapies for spinal injuries, often staying late into the night at the rehabilitation center, her desk illuminated only by the blue glow of her computer screen. Medical journals, case studies, experimental treatments, she devoured them all, searching for anything that might help Max. "There's a veterinary neurologist in Colorado using a combination of cold laser therapy and specialized electrical stimulation," she told Dr. Martinez one morning, sliding research papers across his desk. "His results with similar cases show a 15% improvement rate over traditional methods." The doctor skimmed the papers, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "These are preliminary findings, Sarah. Not peer-reviewed yet. She nodded impatiently. I know, but we need to try everything. Max showed toe movement last week. That means there are intact nerve pathways we can work with. After considerable discussion, the center approved Sarah's request to purchase specialized equipment, a therapeutic cold laser, a custom-designed harness system for supported walking exercises, and electrical stimulation pads calibrated specifically for canine neurological rehabilitation. The expense was considerable, causing tension among the board members who questioned dedicating so many resources to a single case with such a poor prognosis. This equipment won't just be for Max, Sarah had argued during the budget meeting. It's an investment in our rehabilitation program for all future patients. Though not everyone was convinced, her passion and Max's small improvement were enough to secure approval. The water therapy that had initially terrified Max became a cornerstone of his treatment plan after Sarah spent days gradually desensitizing him to the experience. She started by simply allowing him to feel water on his paws, then progressed to supporting him in shallow water, speaking soothingly the entire time. By the third week of this approach, Max was comfortable enough for full hydrotherapy sessions. The underwater treadmill became their most promising tool. The water's buoyancy supported his weight while allowing his legs to move in a natural walking pattern. Look at that! Sarah exclaimed to Jessica during one session, pointing to the slight movement in Max's right hind leg as it drifted in the water. He's not just floating, he's trying to push off. Each small victory was meticulously documented: a toe twitch, increased muscle tone in his thighs, the first signs of reflexive withdrawal when his paw pads were firmly stimulated. Sarah created detailed charts tracking every measurement, building a comprehensive picture of Max's slow but undeniable progress. The nerve pathways are regenerating, she explained to the skeptical Dr. Martinez as they reviewed the data. It's happening millimeter by millimeter, but it's happening. The doctor studied the charts, his professional caution battling with the evidence before him. I've never seen this level of recovery with such severe compression, he admitted, though he quickly added, but we're still a long way from functional mobility. Sarah's dedication caught the attention of Dr. Eleanor Wright, a leading veterinary neurologist visiting the center for a conference. Intrigued by Sarah's detailed documentation and innovative approach, Dr. Wright offered to examine Max and provide consultation. The conventional wisdom is that after 2 weeks without deep pain response, meaningful recovery is unlikely, she told Sarah after a thorough examination. But there are always outliers, cases that defy our medical expectations. She suggested incorporating a cutting-edge therapy involving targeted injections of growth factors near the injury site, combined with intensive physical rehabilitation. It's experimental, she cautioned, but the preliminary results in similar cases are promising. With Dr. Wright's guidance, Sarah developed an even more intensive rehabilitation protocol. Each day began with hydrotherapy, followed by electrical stimulation of specific muscle groups, laser therapy to reduce inflammation around the spinal cord, and supported standing exercises using the custom harness. Max seemed to understand they were fighting for his future. He remained patient through the long sessions, his eyes following Sarah's movements with complete trust. During one particularly grueling therapy session, when Sarah was helping him balance in the supported standing harness, she felt a subtle push against her hand from his right hind leg. "Did you feel that?" she gasped to Jessica, who was adjusting the harness straps. It wasn't random movement, it was coordinated, intentional pressure. That evening, after everyone else had left, Sarah sat on the floor beside Max's therapy mat, gently massaging his gradually strengthening muscles. "We're getting there, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Everyone said it was impossible, but they don't know what I see in you." Max rested his head on her lap, his eyes, always so expressive, seemed to reflect her determination back at her. In that quiet moment, with only the hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence, Sarah realized how completely her life had become intertwined with this small, broken creature who refused to surrender to his damaged body. What had begun as professional determination had transformed into something deeper, a partnership, a shared journey toward what the medical world deemed impossible. As she gathered her things to leave, watching Max settle into his specially padded bed, she knew with absolute certainty that they would prove the skeptics wrong, not because of medical science, but because neither of them knew how to give up. Just as Max's therapy began showing promising signs, disaster struck without warning. Sarah arrived one morning to find him lethargic, his temperature elevated to 103.5 degrees. His normally bright eyes appeared dull and glassy, and he showed no interest in the treats that usually elicited enthusiastic responses. "Something's wrong," she told Dr. Martinez urgently as he examined the puppy. He was fine yesterday, eager for his therapy, responsive, even showing increased movement in his right leg. The doctor's expression grew serious as he conducted a thorough examination. "I'm concerned about a urinary tract infection that may have spread to his kidneys," he said, gently palpating Max's abdomen. "With paralyzed patients, bladder infections are a constant risk, especially with catheterization." Blood tests confirmed their fears. Max's white blood cell count was dangerously elevated, and bacteria had entered his bloodstream, causing sepsis. The infection, common in patients with spinal injuries who couldn't fully empty their bladders, had developed despite Sarah's meticulous catheterization protocol. "We need to start him on broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately," Dr. Martinez ordered, already preparing in 4-line, "and we'll need to suspend all physical therapy until the infection is under control." Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. "Suspend therapy? But we've made so much progress." His muscle tone was improving, he was showing voluntary movement in his toes. The doctor's expression softened with sympathy, but his voice remained firm. "Sarah, right now we're fighting for his life, not his mobility. This kind of setback is exactly why I cautioned you about these cases." For 3 days, Max remained in the intensive care unit, hooked to 4 fluids and antibiotics. Sarah barely left his side, sleeping on a cot beside his enclosure, her hand often reaching through the bars to rest on his fur, reassuring him of her presence. On the second night, his fever spiked to 105 degrees, and the veterinary team discussed the possibility that he might not survive the infection. "We should prepare ourselves," Dr. Martinez told Sarah gently as they monitored Max's labored breathing. "His system is already compromised from the spinal injury. Fighting this infection requires strength he may not have." Sarah nodded numbly, her eyes never leaving Max's small form. "He has the strength," she whispered, more to herself than to the doctor. "He's not giving up, and neither am I." As dawn broke on the 3rd day, Sarah jerked awake from a fitful sleep to find Max watching her through the bars of his enclosure. For a heart-stopping moment, she feared the worst, then she noticed his tail, weakly thumping against the padding of his bed. His temperature had dropped to 101.8, still elevated but dramatically improved. "He's responding to the antibiotics," the night nurse confirmed, checking his latest blood work. "Not out of the woods yet, but definitely fighting back." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool metal bars, tears of relief streaming down her face. The battle for Max's life had been won, but the war for his recovery had suffered a devastating setback. When Max was finally stable enough to return to the rehabilitation ward, the full impact of the infection became clear. All the progress they had made, the strengthening muscle tone, the improved reflexes, the voluntary toe movements, had disappeared. His legs were once again completely flaccid, showing no response even to deep pressure. "It's like starting from scratch," Sarah admitted to Jessica, her voice hollow as they assessed his condition. "Worse than scratch, his muscles have atrophied from the days of immobility, and his system is weakened from fighting the infection." Jessica placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "But we know it's possible now. He did it once, he can do it again." That evening, after a discouraging therapy session where Max had shown no response to any stimulation, Sarah sat alone in the dim rehabilitation room, cradling him gently in her lap. For the first time since taking on his case, she allowed herself to cry openly, deep, racking sobs that came from a place of exhaustion and heartbreak. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into his fur. "I should have prevented this. I should have noticed the symptoms sooner." To her surprise, Max shifted in her arms, awkwardly turning his head to lick the tears from her cheeks. The simple gesture of comfort from the very creature she was meant to be helping broke something open inside her. Through her tears, she found herself laughing softly at the irony. "Look at you, comforting me when it should be the other way around." As Sarah held Max in the quiet room, his warm weight against her chest somehow steadying her despite everything they'd lost, she felt a renewed determination rising through her despair. The setback was devastating, but it had shown her something crucial. Max's spirit remained unbroken. Despite pain, despite infection, despite losing all physical progress, his essential nature, loving, resilient, determined, remained intact. "We're not giving up," she told him firmly, wiping away her tears. "We've proven the impossible once already. Those nerve pathways are there, we just need to find them again. Max's steady gaze seemed to hold an understanding beyond his puppy years, a quiet acceptance of whatever journey lay ahead of them. As she gently placed him back on his therapy mat to begin their evening stretching routine, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that no matter how many setbacks they faced, giving up was the one option that would never be on the table. In the weeks following Max's infection, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected challenge at the rehabilitation center. "We need to discuss resource allocation," Director Collins said during a staff meeting, his expression apologetic but firm. "We've invested significantly in Max's case, but after this setback, we need to be realistic about recovery prospects versus cost." Sarah felt her chest tighten as other staff members nodded in agreement. "With our limited budget, we could help 3 or 4 animals with moderate injuries instead of continuing this intensive therapy for one severe case," added the financial administrator. Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I understand the financial concerns, but Max has already proven the neurologists wrong once. The infection was a setback, not proof that recovery is impossible." After the meeting, Sarah retreated to her small office, mind racing with potential solutions. The specialized equipment had already been purchased, but the daily therapy hours and constant monitoring were straining the center's resources. She stared at the calendar on her wall, noting that they were approaching the 3-month mark she had initially requested, the deadline after which she had promised to reassess if there was no progress. "We're not there yet," she whispered to herself, sketching out a new rehabilitation plan that could maximize results while requiring fewer staff hours. That evening, as she sat beside Max's enclosure reviewing her notes, Dr. Martinez joined her, his expression troubled. "Sarah, I've known you for years, and I've never seen you this invested in a case," he said gently. "I'm concerned about what happens if—" "I've designed a custom mobility aid," Sarah interrupted, unfurling a set of detailed sketches. "It's a modified wheelchair that will grow with him, allowing partial weight bearing on his hind legs while supporting him when he fatigues." Dr. Martinez studied the designs with reluctant admiration. "This is impressive engineering, but building this would be expensive. The board isn't likely to approve additional funding at this point." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm paying for it myself. I've already contacted a fabricator who specializes in adaptive equipment for disabled animals." The doctor sighed, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "You know that even with this device, there's no guarantee he'll regain nerve function." Sarah nodded, reaching through the bars to stroke Max's ear. "But it gives him a chance at mobility while we continue working on neural recovery." The center's physical therapy assistant, Miguel, shook his head when Sarah explained her plan. "You're asking the impossible," he said, reviewing the intensive therapy schedule she had designed. "No one has ever recovered from this level of spinal damage with no deep pain response after infection." Sarah pointed to the small notepad where she had documented Max's progress before the setback. "He did it once, Miguel. That means the neural pathways exist, we just need to find them again." Miguel's skepticism was shared by most of the staff, who had begun treating Sarah with a mixture of pity and exasperation. Only Jessica remained openly supportive, often staying late to help with Max's therapy when others had gone home. The custom wheelchair arrived 2 weeks later, a lightweight frame of titanium and carbon fiber with adjustable supports and specially designed harnesses. It took 3 days of patient introduction before Max was comfortable wearing the harness, but when Sarah finally attached it to the wheelchair frame and supported him into position, something remarkable happened. Max, sensing the support beneath him, immediately attempted to move forward, his front legs working naturally while the wheel supported his hindquarters. "Look at that!" Sarah called to Jessica, who was filming the session. "He's not fighting it, he understands it's helping him." For the first time since his infection, Max moved across the therapy room independently, his expression alert and engaged as he navigated around obstacles with Sarah's guidance. The wheelchair provided Max with psychological benefits that Sarah hadn't anticipated. His mood improved dramatically once he could move freely, and his engagement with therapy exercises increased. While the wheelchair wasn't a cure for his paralysis, it offered him dignity and independence that invigorated his spirit. Sarah integrated the wheelchair into his rehabilitation program, alternating between supported mobility sessions and intensive neural stimulation therapy. She began bringing Max home in the evenings, converting her small apartment into an extension of the rehabilitation center with exercise mats, stimulation equipment, and ramps to accommodate his wheelchair. Her living room became therapy space, her kitchen table disappeared under medical journals and research papers, and her life outside work ceased to exist as she poured every waking hour into Max's recovery. Director Collins called Sarah into his office exactly 3 months after Max's arrival at the center. "You asked for 3 months," he reminded her, reviewing Max's file. "It's been 13 weeks, and after the infection, he's shown minimal neural recovery. The wheelchair is a compassionate solution for quality of life, but it's not the miracle you were hoping for." Sarah sat stiffly in her chair, prepared for this conversation. "I'd like to request an extension," she began, but the director shook his head. "The board has been clear, Sarah. We need those resources for other animals. We can't justify the current level of intervention for one patient with such limited improvement." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. "What are you saying?" The director's expression was sympathetic but resolute. "We're transferring Max to our long-term care facility. He'll receive basic physical therapy to maintain muscle tone, but the intensive rehabilitation program will end." That night, Sarah sat on her apartment floor beside Max, who lay contentedly chewing a toy, occasionally propelling himself around in his wheelchair with surprising dexterity. The thought of him languishing in long-term care, receiving only minimal therapy, made her physically ill. She had seen the facility, well-intentioned but chronically understaffed, with most animals receiving just 15 minutes of therapy per day. After all they had fought for, after how far they had come, it felt like abandonment. As Max nudged her hand with his nose, seeking attention, Sarah made a sudden, life-changing decision. "What if I took you home permanently?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "Not just for evenings, but full-time. I could continue your therapy myself, before and after work." The more she considered it, the more right it felt. She would need to reconfigure her apartment, adjust her schedule, take on the financial burden of his ongoing care, but watching Max navigate his world with determined enthusiasm despite everything he'd endured, she knew with absolute certainty that he was worth any sacrifice. The next morning, Sarah marched into Director Collins' office, her decision made. "I understand the center can't continue Max's intensive therapy," she said without preamble, "so I'm formally requesting to adopt him and continue his rehabilitation privately." The director looked up in surprise. "You want to adopt him?" "Sarah, caring for a permanently disabled animal is an enormous commitment, financially, emotionally, logistically." She nodded firmly. "I'm aware of what I'm taking on, but I believe in his potential for further recovery, and even if I'm wrong, I believe he deserves the chance to find out." Director Collins studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll approve the adoption, but I need you to understand that this decision comes from your heart, not your medical training. The prognosis remains poor for significant recovery." Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you. And with all due respect, sometimes the heart sees possibilities that medical training doesn't." As she left the office to begin the adoption paperwork, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, Max's future was now secure. They would face it together, on their own terms, fighting for every millimeter of progress regardless of what medical science deemed possible. The therapy room had been transformed for this moment. Sarah had cleared away excess equipment, leaving only the essential support bars and a smooth, non-slip mat creating a clear 10-foot path. Soft morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating particles of dust floating lazily in the air. Max rested in his support harness, positioned at one end of the path, his expression alert and focused. For 6 weeks since his adoption, Sarah had dedicated every spare moment to his rehabilitation, waking before dawn for morning therapy sessions, rushing home during lunch breaks to continue exercises, and working late into the night implementing the innovative techniques she'd researched. "Today's the day, buddy," Sarah whispered, adjusting the specialized harness that supported Max's hindquarters while allowing his paws to make contact with the floor. The harness, an improved version of her original design, provided just enough support to compensate for his weakened muscles without bearing his full weight. Jessica stood at the opposite end of the path, recording the session on a tablet. "Everything's ready," she confirmed, giving Sarah an encouraging smile. Martinez had agreed to observe, though his presence was tinged with professional skepticism as he stood quietly by the door, arms crossed, watching with guarded interest. Sarah knelt beside Max, running her hands gently along his spine, feeling for the subtle muscle tone that had slowly returned over the past weeks. The infection had been a devastating setback, but through relentless daily therapy, hydrotherapy, electrical stimulation, laser treatments, and countless hours of supported standing exercises, Max had defied expectations once again. First came the return of reflexes, then the first flickers of voluntary movement in his toes, and finally, over the past week, the unmistakable attempt to bear weight on his right hind leg when supported in the standing harness. Still, despite these promising signs, Max had yet to take an independent step. Today's session would test whether all their work had built enough strength and neural connection for that milestone. "Remember all our practice," Sarah said softly, moving to position herself halfway down the path, holding Max's favorite toy, a small stuffed duck that squeaked when squeezed. "I'll be right here waiting for you." She nodded to Jessica, who carefully decreased the harness's support, allowing Max's paws to bear more of his own weight while still providing enough assistance to keep him balanced. Max's eyes locked onto Sarah and the toy, his focus absolute. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the rapid click of Jessica's camera documenting every moment. Sarah squeezed the toy, its familiar squeak causing Max's ears to perk forward. "Come on, buddy," she called, her voice deliberately bright despite the emotion tightening her throat. "You can do this. Come to me." Max shifted in his harness, his front legs taking a confident step forward. Then came the critical moment. Could his hind legs follow? Everyone in the room held their breath as Max concentrated, his determination palpable. His right hind leg trembled with effort, then, in a moment that seemed suspended in time, it moved forward, not a drag, not a slide, but an actual step. The movement was wobbly and imperfect, but unmistakably voluntary. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, her camera momentarily forgotten as she stared in disbelief. Martinez straightened from his position against the wall, his professional detachment cracking as he moved closer for a better view. Sarah remained perfectly still, afraid any movement might break Max's concentration. "That's it," she encouraged softly, tears welling in her eyes. "Keep coming. You're doing it." Max paused, gathering his strength, then took another step with his right hind leg. His left leg remained less responsive, dragging slightly, but the right leg was clearly bearing weight, clearly moving under voluntary control. Step by trembling step, Max made his way toward Sarah. Each movement was a battle against damaged neural pathways, each forward progression a victory against medical certainty. Halfway down the path, he faltered, his strength waning as his right leg buckled. Sarah started to move toward him, but stopped herself, knowing this was his journey to complete. "You're almost there," she called instead, her voice breaking with emotion. "Just a few more steps. I know you can do it." Max raised his head, his eyes finding hers, and in that moment of connection, Sarah saw something that transcended their therapy sessions and medical charts. Pure, unbreakable will. With renewed determination, Max pushed forward again, his right leg finding its strength, his left now making small, stumbling attempts to follow. The final steps toward Sarah were slow and labored, each one representing countless hours of therapy, setbacks, and small victories that had led to this moment. When he finally reached her, collapsing into her waiting arms, the room erupted in spontaneous applause. Martinez shook his head in amazement, professional skepticism giving way to undeniable evidence. "In 20 years of veterinary medicine," he said, his voice uncharacteristically emotional, "I've never seen anything like this." Sarah cradled Max against her chest, tears streaming freely down her face as she stroked his fur. "You did it," she whispered, her words meant only for him. "You showed them all." Max looked up at her, exhausted but somehow triumphant, his tongue darting out to lick the tears from her cheek in a gesture that had become his signature way of comforting her. The simple act, so full of affection and trust, broke the last of Sarah's professional composure. She buried her face in his golden fur, her shoulders shaking with sobs that were equal parts joy, relief, and overwhelming love for this small creature who had redefined what was possible. Jessica knelt beside them, her own eyes glistening. "I got it all on video," she said, squeezing Sarah's shoulder. "Every miraculous step." Dar. Martinez joined them, crouching to examine Max's legs with new respect. "The neural regeneration is remarkable," he admitted. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself." He looked at Sarah with newfound admiration. "You were right to keep fighting when all the medical evidence suggested otherwise." Sarah smiled through her tears, still cradling Max protectively. "He was worth fighting for. Every single day." As the excitement settled, Sarah gently placed Max back in his supportive harness, knowing he needed rest after such exertion. The steps he had taken were just the beginning. there would be more therapy, more challenges, more moments of progress and frustration ahead. But something fundamental had shifted that morning, something that went beyond physical rehabilitation. In that small therapy room, witnessed by a handful of people, the impossible had become possible, not through medical miracles but through the unquantifiable power of determination, dedication, and love. 6 months after Max's first wobbly steps, the rehabilitation center buzzed with an energy unlike any other day. Staff members adjusted decorations in the main reception area where a banner reading "Max's Miracle, Celebrating Courage" hung prominently across the wall. Sarah knelt beside Max in the adjacent room, making final adjustments to his specialized support harness, a much smaller version than his original equipment, now providing minimal assistance as his strength continued to improve. "Ready for your big day, buddy?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. Max responded with an enthusiastic tail wag that still amazed her every time she saw it, another function the neurologists had said would never return. Max now walked with confidence on his right leg and growing stability on his left, though he still relied on a lightweight supportive harness for longer distances or when fatigue set in. His golden fur gleamed under the lights, a stark contrast to the matted, dull coat he'd had upon arrival nearly a year ago. As Sarah clipped on his special therapy dog vest, emblazoned with "Rehabilitation Ambassador" across its side, she marveled at how thoroughly this small creature had transformed not just his own life, but the entire rehabilitation center. The innovative techniques developed for Max's recovery had been implemented for other severe cases, with promising results that had attracted attention from veterinary rehabilitation specialists across the country. Martinez appeared in the doorway, smiling at the sight of Max standing proudly in his vest. "The first group of students has arrived," he announced. 20 veterinary rehabilitation interns eager to meet our miracle puppy. Following Max's breakthrough, Dr. Martinez had become one of his strongest advocates, helping Sarah secure funding for a new rehabilitation program specifically focused on severe spinal injuries previously considered untreatable. "I still remember telling you there was less than a 5% chance," he admitted, shaking his head in wonder as Max walked toward him with only the slightest wobble in his left hind leg. "You've rewritten our understanding of neural recovery potential." The rehabilitation wing had expanded significantly, now featuring equipment and therapy protocols inspired by Max's journey. Where once there had been skepticism and resource constraints, there was now innovation and hope. Director Collins, who had originally questioned the investment in Max's case, now proudly showcased the Rehabilitation Center as a pioneering facility in spinal recovery research. "Sarah," he called, entering the room with an elderly woman using a walker. "There's someone special here to meet Max before the presentation." The woman smiled warmly, her eyes fixed on Max with unmistakable emotion. "My Bella had the same injury," she explained, her voice wavering slightly. "They told me she would never walk again, but after your team worked with her using Max's protocols, she's now taking short walks in the backyard. I had to come thank the little pioneer who made it possible." As the morning progressed, Max performed his ambassador duties with natural charm, approaching each veterinary student with friendly curiosity, demonstrating his walking abilities with obvious pride. For the afternoon demonstration, Sarah guided Max through his therapy routine, explaining each technique to the attentive audience of veterinary professionals. "The key breakthrough came when we realized traditional rehabilitation timelines don't apply to every case," she explained, supporting Max through a complex balance exercise. "Conventional wisdom said that without deep pain response after 2 weeks, significant recovery was unlikely. Max proved that neural regeneration can occur even months later with the right interventions." Dr. Martinez added clinical context, presenting before and after imaging that showed the remarkable neural regrowth around Max's damaged spinal segments. "We're now documenting similar responses in approximately 30% of severe cases previously considered permanent," he noted, triggering excited murmurs through the audience. After the formal presentations, Sarah and Max retreated to the quiet of her office, once a small, utilitarian space, now expanded to accommodate both her administrative role as rehabilitation research director and Max's daily needs. Max settled contentedly on his specially designed orthopedic bed beside her desk, tired but satisfied after his big day. Sarah knelt beside him, running her hand gently along his spine, still marveling at the muscle tone that had developed where once there had been only flaccid paralysis. "You've changed everything," she told him softly. "Not just for yourself, but for so many others who would have been given up on. Max looked up at her with the same trusting eyes that had captured her heart on that first desperate day, his expression somehow wise beyond his years. As evening approached, Sarah collected Max's support harness and therapy equipment, preparing to head home to the small house they now shared, purchased specifically for its single-level layout and fenced yard where Max could practice his walking skills in safety. Their journey together had evolved from professional dedication to something much deeper, a partnership forged through countless hours of shared struggle, setbacks, and ultimately, triumph. Walking beside her with the determined gait that had become his signature, Max no longer resembled the broken puppy from the examination table. Though his walk would always carry the subtle markers of his injury, a slight hitch in his left leg, occasional fatigue requiring rest, his spirit radiated an undeniable message to everyone they encountered. What seems impossible is often simply waiting for someone who refuses to accept defeat. The sunset painted golden streaks across the sky as they left the center, reminiscent of Max's golden fur and the golden moments of breakthrough that had defined their journey. Tomorrow would bring new patience, new challenges, new opportunities to apply what Max had taught them about the remarkable resilience of the body and spirit. But for tonight, as Max trotted happily beside her across the parking lot, occasionally looking up as if to check that she was still there, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. Not because their journey had ended, Max would continue therapy for the rest of his life, but because together they had rewritten what was possible, transforming medical constraints into mere challenges waiting to be overcome. And in doing so, they had created not just a rehabilitation protocol, but a living testament to the extraordinary power of determination, specialized care, and the unbreakable bond between a dedicated therapist and the little dog who refused to give up.